Today at the National Press Club, actor and producer Bryan. He's been a fixture on our screens for more than 4 decades and has lobbied the federal government in recent years to secure support for Australia's film industry. Bryan today at the National Press Club.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, Canberra. My name is Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. For the past half-century, our film and television industry has been a crucial part of our cultural life and the way we see ourselves. Our guest today has been an integral part of that through a huge career in Australian film and television, as well as a stellar international career. Particularly in the post-COVID era, the Australian film and television industry is booming on the back of international productions for an international marketplace. But a crucial question in the era of streaming is whether the demand for international content made for international audiences threatens the way we see ourselves and our culture. To reflect on a career which has taken him to extraordinary places and to talk about where the industry heads next, please join me in welcoming Bryan to address us.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present on whose lands we are today. So good afternoon. My name is Bryan and I'm a Westie. Born and raised in the western suburbs of Sydney by my mother in a Housing Commission house, I learned all the skills required for a life playing in the Milperra swamps, the streets of Panania, the Georges River at Picnic Point, the local Catholic church, and the Panania Picture Theatre. For that, I am grateful. In 1968, I was working at the AMP Society at Circular Quay, studying to be an actuary. In those days, actuarial studies wasn't included in any Australian university curriculum. It had to be done by correspondence from London or Edinburgh and would take about 7 years on average to complete. I was doing it because I was good at maths, having achieved honours in Maths 1 and Maths 2 in the Leaving Certificate, and because I had no idea what I wanted to do after leaving school. University wasn't an option, as I'd use it as a social opportunity and so fail in any course that I'd chosen to enrol in. It was coming up to the end of 1968, and a newsletter went around the company informing the staff that the drama club, and yes, there was a drama club at the AMP, and there was a bike club and a skydiving club and quite a few other clubs, that the drama club would be staging an end-of-the-year review in the theaterette on the ground floor for 3 nights. And the newsletter welcomed any staff that wished to audition. A day or two later, I presented myself to the audition process. This wasn't because I had any desire to act, but once again, an opportunity to take advantage of a social situation. There would obviously be girls there that I hadn't met. That half-hour or so audition process led me on a journey that has taken me to some 40 countries, seen me thrown into the Pearl River in Guangzhou, taken on a private tour of the White House, celebrate my 40th birthday on the top of a mountain in Rwanda, hurl bottles with Tom Cruise, sing with Paul McCartney, and share a bath with Sigourney Weaver, and marry one of Hollywood's rising stars, Rachel Ward. Strange, but wonderful happenings. As a young bloke growing up in the western suburbs of Sydney in the 50s and 60s, I went to the movies most Saturday afternoons. Saw a lot of John Wayne and Lassie, and the odd Rank movie from England. That's rank, as in rank organisation. A bloke with hardly any clothes on took a huge sledgehammer and bashed a large piece of steel, making an almighty boom. The rank organisation doesn't exist today. There was one Australian film released during that time. It was a film of a great Australian play, Summer of the 17th Doll. It was a story of 2 Aussie cane cutters and their 2 girlfriends they'd visit in Melbourne every year during the off-season. For 17 years, one of them would bring a doll as a gift. The four actors telling this great Australian story were the American actors Ernest Borgnine and Shelley Winters and Anne Baxter, and the English actor John Mills. At school, I don't remember reading any Australian book or play. Let's get it right, Australian history came second to English history, if it came anywhere at all. The sum of my knowledge of the Australian arts world was a poem that began, "I love a sunburnt country," and an Aboriginal artist called Albert Namatjira. Both definitely worth knowing, but a little limited as a knowledge of one's own country's art culture. But back to the AMP. Having read the script that I was presented with in order to audition for the end of the year review, I was aware I had no idea what I was doing. And then I was asked to read opposite another employee who was also auditioning. Something must have worked because the powers in charge said I could be in the review and to turn up after work the next day for rehearsals, whatever rehearsals were. Now, I like going to work. I enjoyed the people around me, and I enjoyed the salary that gave me some independence. But that next morning was different to any other morning. I really couldn't wait to go to work because at the end of the day, I would be doing this thing called rehearsals. Thrilling beyond belief. The review went on before Christmas '68. I loved it. I couldn't rationalise why I loved it, but I wanted more. I gave up studying to be an actor and became a salesman for the AMP, selling life insurance. And I joined an amateur theatre in Kent Street in Sydney. Smart move, because as a salesman, no one had a clue where you were during the day, as long as you got your figures in on the Friday afternoon. So the amateur theatre began to take up a hell of a lot of my time, reading plays, rehearsing plays, and acting in plays. By 1972, I knew I had a decision to make, either give up this all-consuming time at the theatre and get on with a proper career, or resign and become an actor professionally. I resigned. I sold my car and I bought a ticket to England, the home of theatre. In fact, the reason I left Australia in 1972 to become an actor was that all I saw on Australian stages were Australian actors doing English and American plays in English and American accents. It seemed pretty silly doing that in Australia, so I went to England to do it firsthand. I would become a POM. I would become a professional actor in England. My flight to England was via Athens, and so I took a boat out to the island of Mykonos. And it was there my journey into English theatre began. I got talking to a young English boy who told me his father was in the theatre. Ears pricked up. Yep, he was a fireman at one of the London theatres. All theatres had a steel fire curtain and a fireman in attendance at all performances. For some, that might have been the end of the conversation, but I knew I had to get started and was prepared to clean toilets, sell programs, do anything. The English boy said to look his father up and he'd help me, and he did. Got me a job pushing scenery at the Victoria Palace, a theatre where the hugely popular entertainer Max Bygraves was performing with dancing girls and a ventriloquist. I was in the theatre. That led to me moving out to the provinces in the north of England, Billingham, where I was hired as a stagehand, and that led me to being offered the chance to be an actor, a professional actor with a theatre and education company playing in schools twice a day. I continued with this company for a good 6 months until the second half of 1973, and then went back to England and pushing scenery. Back to London. I didn't have an agent, but a theatrical paper, The Stage, would often advertise auditions that were going on. And one such audition was for a prestigious company called the Actors Company, headed by Ian McKellen. The company was going to the US to cover the universities there with a couple of Shakespearean plays. They needed a dog's body actor who could also help out backstage. I auditioned. That night I was rung by one of the actresses from the company to say they wouldn't be offering me a job, but they had liked me and that her sister, Gillian Diamond, was the casting director at the National Theatre of Great Britain, and that now that Peter Hall had taken over from Sir Laurence Olivier, he was putting together a new company of actors, and would I like to audition? The answer was bloody oath. So a couple of days later, I'm auditioning for Gillian with a Barone speech from Shakespeare's Love Labour's Lost. And again, a call in the evening from Gillian, asking if I would be available to audition for Peter Hall the next day. Oh, and do I have a song, as a musical maestro for the National will also be at the audition. So it's on. And luckily, I'd been working with an opera mate who'd been trying to get me to stay in tune on the Red, Red Robin. Yep, got a song. The audition was at the Old Vic, the home of the National Theatre. There was one actor before me, and so I was to wait backstage behind the curtain until he was finished. I didn't really pay attention to his Shakespeare, but when he did his song, I shat myself. It was an aria. That was what they meant by singing. I was brought on stage and introduced by Gillian, who told them what my piece was, which seemed to go okay. Peter Hall asked me to do it a second time and to slow down. I did, as he asked. Then Gillian told Peter and the musical maestro that I would be doing the Red, Red Robin. Peter smiled, and I Red, Red Robined. Like this. When the red, red robin comes bob, 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 and along, along, there'll be no more sun when he comes singing. Anyway, that's how I did it. I knew it was good. The maestro gave me a couple of notes and asked me to hold on to them, and then it was over. Gillian took my hand and said she'd be in touch, and she was. That night, I was offered a year's contract with the National Theatre of Great Britain, the whole of 1974. 18 months out of Panania, pretty exciting, got pissed that night. On a return visit to Australia at the end of 74 to see my mother, theatre here had changed dramatically. Australian playwrights had taken over the stages and were presenting plays about Australians. David Williamson's plays, The Removalists, Don's Party, What If You Died Tomorrow, and Travelling North, all spoke of us silly buggers. How Does Your Garden Grow, by the ex-con Jim McNeill, was a powerful indictment of our prison system. Jack Hibbard and Alex Buzo had their plays being performed in exciting venues all over the country. For me, there was no point in returning to England. We now had a voice, and it was an exciting, fresh new voice for all the world to hear, and I wanted to be a part of it. It may be difficult for some of you to understand how exciting this change was. It was as though the shackles had come off and we were set free. Free to explore who we were, where we'd come from, and where we were going. And to do it in our own way with our own people. Never again the summer of the 17th doll experience, we hope. In January 1977, I did my first film. It was a 50-minute feature funded by the Australian Film Commission. The film was called Love Letters from Teralba Road and dealt with the disintegration of a marriage. I played a rather violent and sad young man. That was 45 years ago, and it was the early days of the resurgence of the Australian film industry. They were heady times, the 70s, making movies. We were like gunslingers from the West, the wild, wild West. Except this wild West was in Australia, and we were making Australian films. And Australian films were reaching out to the world, and the world was reaching out to us, actors, writers, directors. Fred Skepsey had tackled the brutally complex The Chan of Jimmy Blacksmith, the story of an Indigenous man fighting to right the racism he experienced. Breaker Morant, directed by Bruce Beresford, examined the politics of war. In Gillian Armstrong's beautiful period film, My Brilliant Career, we witnessed a young woman's struggle to escape expectations and become a writer. And Picnic at Hanging Rock gave us a harrowing mystery with the disappearance of schoolgirls in outback Victoria, directed by Peter Weir. And not a car chase or crash to be seen. Not until, of course, George Miller's Mad Max reimagined the genre. And then Phil Noyce's Newsfront highlighted social change rocking Australia after World War II through the escapades of newsreel cameramen. Profound, complex, necessary questions about the human experience from creative and questioning Australian men and women. You know, we had a thriving film industry way back. The first Australian films were produced back in 1886. Sort of home movies, us at the racetrack or at Manly coming off the wharfs. Then in 1900, the Australian Salvation Army, what is acknowledged as the forerunner of the feature film, when they made Soldier of the Cross, a multimedia religious production with slides, 90-second films and 150 odd performers. And it didn't stop there. 6 years later, the world's first full-length feature film was produced. And where was that? Yep, here in Australia. The Story of the Kelly Gang, produced by Charles Tate. Significantly, Australia then went on to become the major source of film production in the world, and during the period 1906 to 1928, produced a total of 150 films. But then came the Depression, the introduction of costly sound technology, and the lack of interest in Australian films by the American-owned distribution companies. So we had to wait until the late 60s for a resurgence. And what a resurgence it was. If just one or two of those films I mentioned had been produced by any independent film industry, that industry could feel extremely proud. But during the 70s and early 80s, Australia sent out to the world a number of the finest films ever made. And as an actor who was lucky enough to be a part of that film, that time, it was hugely exciting. We got paid, and a fair bit more than what we've been getting doing theatre in the pubs and all sorts of venues in the Sydney Opera House. And then it was exotic, flying to Adelaide, or Melbourne, or Brisbane. Very exotic to a bunch of broke actors in the 70s. But the most exciting part of it was we were telling our stories and telling them with our voice, our sensibility. Sharing the Australian experience, the place, its people, its struggles, its history, its strength and its weaknesses. So where did this creativity come from? Well, it was there in its people, wasn't it? All that was needed was a visionary government to recognise it and support it. And that's what John Gorton's government did. And a modern Australian film culture was born, and the film floodgates opened, and it has continued. Continued to be supported by both sides of politics. For that, we Australians can be very grateful. I remember saying to Bill Hunter, one of our great film actors, you know, we make bloody good dramas and we're funny buggers, but we'll never make a comedy. And then Paul Hogan made that statement, The Crockett Was, with Crocodile Dundee. And the world laughed and loved this Australian character. And so comedies followed. Muriel's Wedding and Strictly Ballroom and The Dressmaker and Priscilla, Queen of the Desert and The Castle. And crime, which of course we had to be good at given our convict past. Chopper and Two Hands and Animal Kingdom. And then Indigenous films with relevant themes from past and present. Rabbit Proof Fence, The Sapphires, Samson and Delilah, Top End Wedding and Sweet Country. I was lucky enough to play a role in Sweet Country and attended the screening at the Venice Film Festival with the producer David Jowsey and Sam Neill and the writer and director Warwick Thornton. You could have heard a pin drop at the end of the screening, and then we faced a 5-minute standing ovation from a highly sophisticated audience, lauding the extraordinary talent of Warwick Thornton, an Indigenous filmmaker who that night brought great acclaim to Australia with a tough, honest and beautiful film. Many, many films have delivered through the years. Big hits and consistently good box office. Australia, Ride Like a Girl, Lion, Ladies in Black, The Water Diviner, The Dry, The Odd Angry Shot, The Man Who Sued God, The Piano, Breath, Rams, Penguin Blue, Palm Beach, Invisible Man, The Man from Snowy River, Looking for Alabama, Bandy, Babe, The Year My Voice Broke, Moulin Rouge, Dirty Deeds, Lantana. I've touched on such a few. And that's all we needed, was it? A resurgence and all would be fine? Roll them out and keep them rolling? No. Of course it doesn't work like that. Films and of course TV need financing, and financing structures continue to change, especially now as technology opens up so many new ways to deliver stories into people's homes. Early on, it was pretty straightforward. A combination of Australian Film Commission investment and state investment and a distributor's advance, and rules on commercial TV to show new drama, kids shows and documentaries on those few channels we had. The serving of our stories in our homes. Then we needed overseas sales advances, and that started to bring in the pressure on casting. There was 10BA during the 80s, a 150% tax write-off and a tax of only 50% on the return. Money flowed, but it was a flawed model. It was more about moving money around than making good films. We lost our way somewhat, but we kept producing. Now we have an offset, a tax offset. For Australian film, a 40% tax rebate on the budget of the film. We nearly lost that in 2021. There was a move to reduce that to 30%. The government announced additional support for offshore production, American films and TV in the main, increasing their offset to 30%, bringing it in line with Australian television offset. And our film industry, the Australian film industry, the industry that told Australian films, was to pay for that increase in offshore production, robbing Crocodile Dundee to pay for Forrest Gump. Yep, offshore production is encouraged to film here, and the offset is the incentive. Economically, it makes sense. Overseas productions are always looking for ways to finance their budgets. A large part of that offset will be spent in Australia, and for Australian crews, it creates work opportunities. Offshore production is fine if it is balanced. I was filming in Toronto 20 years ago on an American production. At the time, there were 38 American productions being shot all over Canada, but mainly in Toronto. Good for the industry, lots of employment? Well, you work it out. If a Canadian filmmaker had a movie to be shot at that time, he'd have trouble putting a 20th-rate crew together. His cinematographer would most probably be in first year at film school. Offshore production is exactly that, offshore, with its allegiance offshore. The decrease in the offset from 40% to 30% for Australian film would have been death to our film industry. The government listened and the 40% was retained. They say if the film is good enough, the market will finance it. This is the marketplace, the offset. And offshore production is here for that. And let's not kid ourselves. If Bulgaria or Hungary or Brazil or whatever comes up with a better deal or a better offset than ours, our offshore production will become their offshore production. And they then will become a suburb of LA. There will be changes, and sometimes those changes could threaten our Australian film industry, and the industry will come again to Canberra to remind the government of the day how important our film culture is. And that is why we must remain vigilant, committed, disciplined, and persistent. If our ability to present ourselves on film is taken away, we'll become unsure of ourselves, in awe of others, and less as a people. A thriving film and television industry presents who we are to the world. In 1981, a miniseries I did for Channel 7 here in Australia was shown. It was hugely successful and set a benchmark for quality television. The show was a 6-hour television adaptation of Neville Shute's A Town Like Alice. It was sold all over the world, and the US went out on the prestigious Masterpiece Theatre on PBS television. Masterpiece then really only showed the best of English television, including I, Claudius and Brideshead Revisited. It once again proved itself to be hugely popular and received glowing praise and reviews all over the US. It won an international Emmy. A number of months later, a gentleman who was the editor of a major Washington newspaper was a guest in Australia speaking on the role of the media in society. I received a call from him. He introduced himself and explained to me that he'd been asked to track me down by a Nancy Reynolds, who was a great friend of his and it seems a great friend of the White House. Nancy Reagan was her best friend. Both Nancys had loved the show, and an invitation was extended to me that if I was to visit the States at all in the near future, a personal tour of Washington and the White House was available. As it happened, I was on my way in a couple of weeks to the US to promote Breaker Moran, so I jumped at the invite. Nancy Reynolds was an extremely lovely and generous lady, and on being flown to Washington, I was for 2 days wined and dined with US senators and Washington journalists. and taken to the White House and through the White House by Nancy. It was a great experience. I met many of the staff and was taken to restricted areas. Reagan was president, George Bush Sr. was vice president. At lunch, I was taken to meet George Bush, who was both cordial and charming and inquisitive about Australia. As we left that afternoon, Nancy informed me that it had been arranged for me to go to the President's office and meet President Reagan, but there'd been a last-minute change of plans due to the Saudis suddenly arriving for a meeting to buy $1 billion worth of planes. Fair enough excuse for getting shunted, I thought. But what I couldn't help thinking was what the power of television was. All because of a mini-series that had caught the American public's imagination. Doors had been opened to me that business people would have given their eye teeth for. And the hunger for knowledge about Australia was obvious. Their imagination had been pricked. It was both the country itself and the spirit of the people portrayed in a town like Alice that had grabbed them. My early years at the National Theatre informed me as to how important and what a huge part the arts play in the sophisticated cultural life of Great Britain. In many ways, the arts defines Great Britain. It's for its cultural life that so many tourists visit. Take the great arts institutions such as the Royal Museum, Royal Shakespeare Company, National Gallery, Royal Opera out of the UK, close down the theatres in London and provincial theatre, and it becomes a bleak old place. Why is it we know so much about other countries? Why is London so familiar to those who have never been there, or New York, or Paris, or Rome? Why is it our kids say butt now, not bum, wear baseball caps, turn to the other side? The answer is obvious. Television and film, its power is so great. We know how the mafia speak, dress, and where they live. The American Wild West is more known to us than our own outback. Powerful stuff, film. And that power was enormous benefit to Australian tourism when the shoe was on the other foot and Crocodile Dundee hit the States. Croc Dundee was a phenomenon. Happens not often. But before it and after it came television and film that kept people all over the world aware of Australia, interested in it and inquisitive about its people, what we do and who we are. I believe that what film and television and literature do is introduce us to the spirit of a people. Crocodile Dundee and Muriel's Wedding and Breaker Morant and Tim Winton's Dirt Music, Tom Keneally's and Kate Grenville's wonderful novels, and our musos Midnight Oil and Yothu Yindi presented to the world the spirit of a people that is exotic and different from other peoples. And our spirit is different. And it's a spirit that continues in our present Australian actors on the world stage. Sarah Snook, Liam and Chris Hemsworth and Margot Robbie, all who got their start through the local industry. It's different because our journey is different. From convict ships to pioneering a vast continent with millions of inhospitable square kilometres, to going to strange wars in faraway places to support allies, to whipping the arses off larger nations at sport, in colonising a culture that had been 65,000 years in the making. The struggles that brings, so different and so much to explore. We have still only touched the surface. Back in 1987, my agent rang saying that Michael Apted wanted to meet with me in London. He was about to direct a film on the life of Deanne Fossey called Gorillas in the Mist, starring Sigourney Weaver. And they were interested in me playing the National Geographic photographer Bob Campbell, Deanne Fossey's lover. I flew to London a couple of days later to meet with Sigourney and Michael. Now, I'd seen Greystoke, the film that fictionalised who Tarzan was, Viscount Greystoke. It was a great film with blokes dressed up in monkey suits all running around Pinewood Studios in London. I imagine that's where Gorillas in the Mist would be shot. After my meeting with Sigourney and Michael, the part was offered to me. I asked when I'd be needed in London and was told, no. The film will be shot in Rwanda, in Africa. Cool. Never been there. Good idea. More authentic. On flying to Rwanda, I asked who the actors would be wearing the monkey suits. Oh no, I was informed. We'll be shooting with the real gorillas. Cool. More authentic, I agree. My first day out there, there were about 200 porters carrying gear up the side of a mountain where the guerrillas lived. This went on for some 2 hours, at which stage an army-type fellow with a rifle came out to say the guerrillas were about 200 metres into the jungle. We stopped, got into costume and makeup, camera was offloaded and film was loaded. I was very happy to see the bloke with the gun. Next, we were told to accompany the guard into the jungle. Just 4 of us. Sigourney, myself, focus puller and camera operator. That's all allowed, not even the director. And a researcher with a pad and a pencil. We followed the guard into the jungle, and then he called us forward and pointed to the guerrillas. A huge silverback, a smaller huge silverback, about 10 females and maybe 5 youngsters. And then as the herd moved off, he waved for us to follow him, to follow them. I looked at the researcher and I said, what about the bloke with the gun? Will he be coming with us? And I was told, no, it wasn't allowed. Just the 5 of us with a pencil as our only weapon. Wasn't all that keen on authenticity at that point. We had to follow them for 4 hours as they ate their way through the jungle, and then they stopped to rest. This was my moment to move among them, photographing them, and waiting for my head to be lifted from my shoulders and my body thrown over the cliff. Never happened before, they'd say. Never had an Australian actor thrown off a cliff with his head missing. But it didn't happen. I filmed amongst these extraordinary animals for some time that day, in front of them, with my back to them, amongst them. When I came back to camp, I was asked, what was it like? And I didn't have a word to describe the experience. Relief to be alive, excitement to be among these creatures, the delight as they played together. It was overwhelming. An impossible experience made possible because of making a film. I turned 40 up there. Could I ever have imagined that? If someone had said to me, where do you think you'll turn 40? I wouldn't have said on a mountain in Rwanda surrounded by a bunch of gorillas. I might have said on the moon, because we'd seen people land on the moon at that stage. That made more sense. Not in my wildest dreams could I have imagined that experience. As I mentioned earlier, with the resurgence, the world, or Hollywood, same thing, came calling, and our producers were now lent an ear. They were able to now build a business, get in bed with the studios, but at the same time retain some intellectual property or ownership. And that meant a library for them and further royalties down the track. Create a business. There's a new game on the block for our industry, streaming. Australian audiences are loving streaming, and a few $1 billion in revenue is handed over by us each year to the streaming companies. We need some of that revenue put back into Australian stories. And I mean Australian stories, not stories filmed in Australia with American accents. That's a cultural death. We've been there. Canada and France have legislated that revenue taken from their countries must go into local production. In France, it's over 25%. A 20% reinvestment obligation, complemented by strong and sound IP arrangements, would help secure the future of our industry and keep it vibrant. The streaming companies will fight hard to not legislate. They're a business, and we must fight just as hard, because this is for our culture. I'm sure once again we'll all find an answer and so move forward. We owe it to Australians, Indigenous, old migrants and new, to keep telling our stories, our Australian stories, and what a story the Australian story is. The oldest living culture colonised by one of the most powerful empires the world has seen and handed to a bunch of misfits to make it work. Good luck with that. But bloody good stories. The more I've travelled, the more I note that as different as our origins may be, and as far apart as we may live, the world is inhabited by people with very similar needs. Our hopes for our families are the same. Our conflicts no different, whether they are personal or political. Our desire to be challenged as strong, and our need to express ourselves overwhelmingly important to us. That's why when we see a film or TV show that works, it's because in the story we recognise our own humanity. No matter where its country of origin, whether we laugh or whether we cry, whether we are thrilled or whether we are astounded, film brings us together. So let's do everything we can to support each other in our endeavours to produce good Australian stories. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bryan.
Come there?
Yeah, come and have a seat. Look, lots of things to talk about in your career and about streaming and local content, but singing with Paul McCartney.
Yeah. You can get lucky, can't you? So, I'm in Hawaii and I'm filming The Thornbirds with my wife, Rachel Ward. She wasn't my wife then. She was just someone that was keenly interested in me. Anyway, the phone goes about 5:30 in the morning, and there's this Liverpudlian voice on the end of it saying, "Hi, Bryan, this is Paul McCartney. This is your early morning call." Now, I'd been told that Paul was interested in me. He was going to do an hour's telly movie, sort of explaining what the life of a Beatle was, instead of how we all think what their life might be. That would involve his kids and Linda McCartney, who was his wife at the time. And he was interested in me wanted me to play his manager, and that he would ring me. And so anyway, he rang me. And I said, well, yeah, so I'm doing this movie and I'd like you to play my manager. And I said, yeah, right, that'd be good. It's sort of difficult to talk to a Beatle. You know, because there's a whole part of this normal bloke saying he's got a job for you, and there's the other part of it you're going, for Christ's sake, this is a Beatle. Anyway, he was lovely. I said, well, have you got a script? He said, yeah, I'll send you the script. And I remember thinking, it just doesn't matter how bad this script is, I'm doing it. This is Paul McCartney. So I signed on to do it. First of all, I loved the fact that he rang personally to talk to me. And then I arrive in London and I go to the big community hall where was their production office. And I arrive and I go to the front of the hall, and right down the back of the hall is a massive table with about 20 people all around. And I can see that the back of one of those people is definitely Paul McCartney, and sitting next to him on an angle is Linda. And Linda sees me at the end of the hall. And she says to Paul turns around and he sees me and he gets up and he walks the length of the room and he comes down and he says, Bryan, Paul McCartney, so glad you could join us. And I remember thinking, that's the measure of the man. It wasn't an acolyte. It wasn't someone who ran around, clean out his waste bin. It was Paul McCartney going and saying the right thing. And I remember thinking, and I've never seen anything written about him or said about him that ever doesn't show that it's the same man. So it's great when you come across those things. Oh, and then we actually, down in the BBC, when we're shooting, down in the offices of down in the toilet of the BBC, we get to sing Zippity Doodah together. And it's on film.
Not Red, Red Robin. Just a couple of things I'm going to indulge myself in my presidential capacity. You talked about, I get to ask a few more questions.
Yeah.
You were talking about a town like Alice, and so many of those characters you played were, absolutely archetypal, white, Anglo-Saxon, Aussie personification of, earlier eras.
Difficult for me to stretch to something else.
But it's interesting, isn't it? you know, what we're trying to portray in the Australian film and television industry is very different now. I mean, you've just finished, I think,
Boy Who Swallowed the
Universe. You know, there's a multicultural side to Australian culture. We've got obviously Indigenous films. It's a very different story. It's a very different country. How do you see Australia now?
I mean, that's what's great about it, is our society's moved on. You know, if this was the resurgence of the industry now, it would be our stories would be very different. You know, there would be stories that show the journey of migrants to the country, the things they've had to deal with. There would be stories of overcoming. There would be stories of standing up for yourself. There would still be the same ingredient of what we as human beings have to stand for. And they would show the struggles of the many different cultures that have come to call Australia home. And that's the great thing that we're now able to do. We're now, there's a great push for that diversity. You see it everywhere. You see it in the ads on TV. You see it everywhere. There is the push to go, let's really represent the country that we are.
So you've talked about the need for local content regulations in the streaming services, but I couldn't help but notice that the last 4 things I think you've done for television over the last 3 or 4 years have all been for streaming services, but they have actually all been Australian stories. What is it that's missing? Why do we need that local content rule?
Well, look, the simple fact of the matter is about $2 million gets handed to the streamers by us, the consumers. It's a lot of money. We have this offset, which allows them to bring people over and to film for their shows and get handed money by us. What we're saying is that a percentage of that $2 billion should go back into being stories that are actually about Australia, that are Australian stories, not just stories that are set in Australia with, in the main, American accents. It's about going, I mean, there's so much product out there, as we all know when you go onto a streaming service. We've got to be very careful that we don't get lost in the shuffle. We've got to be able to hold our heads up. We've got to be able to go here's and here. And the thing, this is the thing too, I think. With that extra money that we can get from the streamers, allows us more time to develop, allows us more time to be able to shoot, therefore allows us to make our shows reach the great heights that we want them to be. We can go to some of our great literature. We can go to some idea can be fully realised and worked on over a number of years to get to, before it gets to the film. We need that opportunity, and it's an insignificant amount of money that really we're asking them to put in here. It's about 1% of the global revenue that they make. It's not a lot of money, but it's a lot of money to us, and it allows our companies to create businesses, and all the companies that make film in Australia, they're small companies, all the creative companies. Those companies enables them to have a business that can continue and keep making Australian film and television. It's very important.
Julie Hare has a question.
Thank you for your speech. It was very enjoyable. Julie Hare from the Australian Financial Review. How are you? So you didn't receive any formal teaching in acting or drama, and you created an obviously stellar career by a mix of sheer talent and happy accidents. What would you say to a kid today who wants to become an actor or a writer or a director? Would you suggest they go to acting schools such as NIDA or the VCA? Would you suggest they just go onto a set and try and get some work experience, or would you tell them to become an actuary and earn a decent wage?
Yeah, no, I tell them all to join the AMP. No, look, it's the same, I think. People come to it in their own way. You know, I think I came to it because I needed to come to it. I sometimes think, what happens if that little piece of paper didn't come round saying, you know, you can go up and audition? What would have happened? Well, you know, like, would I have ended up in some other career, commercial, whatever? I don't honestly know. But I know I wouldn't have been fulfilled. So maybe I'd have found it in another way, because I needed to express myself. That's what it came down to. I needed to I don't know, pretend I was someone else and live their lives for a while. So if you have that need, a young man or woman that has that need, I would say to them, just bloody go and just knock on doors. You know, it's like anything. You want to get somewhere, you just got to go for it. And you got to go. You're going to be rejected, you're going to be knocked back, but you've got to hang through that. One of the lucky things that I got through being an insurance salesman was rejection. And one of the things that we were taught, they said, you'll get a statistic and you'll work out what your statistic is. You might have to ring 100 people to get 10 interviews. And of those 10 interviews, you might sell to one person. So you know your statistic is 1 in 10. So I've always told my children, like, embrace the no's because it'll get you closer to the yes. Oh, thank Christ he said no. Got that one out of the road.
Thank you.
James Elton.
Hello. Thanks for your speech. You mentioned that you anticipate the streamers fighting quite hard. I sent Netflix some questions about this and got this back from them. I just wonder if I can put it to you. They say, on media regulation, Netflix's position is clear. We don't oppose it, but we do want it to be sustainable, equitable and evidence-based so it creates good outcomes for Australian storytellers and audiences. I guess underpinning some of this counter-argument is a fear that the Australian production sector can't scale up to such an extent that would be required if there were all this additional money coming in as a result of a content quota. What's your read on that? What's your response to that? And do you think that the Australian production sector actually does have it in it to go through a sort of modern resurgence?
Yeah, nice try, I'd say to the streamer. Nice try. The money in there will allow the companies that exist today to expand, to look for more creative people to join them, give the opportunity for writers to come up with ideas. It can only be a positive thing. And can we use it? Can we make it work? You bet your life we can. But nice try.
Rachel Baxter.
Thank you, Bryan, for your speech. Rachel from the 7 Network. Is there a risk that these new laws to require streaming services to have a percentage of Australian content, is there a risk that that won't see streaming services withdraw from the Australian market altogether? And a second question, if I will, we've seen a Top Gun 2. Will we see a Cocktail 2? Because I would love that. I know your character was
I'll answer the second one first. If there is a Cocktail 2, I'm dead. But they seem to be able to do anything. So maybe my twin brother, who was living in Australia at the time, happens to come back and be found in a bar drunk.
I love it already.
And as to whether they'll withdraw, do you honestly believe that some place that's making $2 billion in revenue, that is asked to put 20% of that away, which is, say, 400 million, do you reckon they're going to go, no, we're not going to do that. We don't want the other 1.6 billion. No. It's, you know, once again, like, it doesn't make any sense. They're a business. They want to make money. There's a lot of money to be made out of Australia. And we're happy to give them that money. We love turning on the streamers. We love watching the shows we love. But we're saying, boys and girls, you've got to step up to the mark. You've got to make local stuff.
Thank you.
Craig Foster.
Not going to answer anything about football.
I won't ask you, mate. I've asked you enough. Congratulations on an extraordinary life, an incredible career, and a wonderful speech. The impact on Hollywood of Australian filmmaking is irrefutable, measured in the abundance of actors like yourself, steady streams of films made here. But we are, in many respects, an exporter. Most of our big actors here in American films, and most of the movies made here, as you called offshore production, are merely on location. Can you give us the benefit of your experience, please, how that can change and what you see the future as?
Well, the future can only be good because it does give the opportunities for different actors who want to and are able to get other opportunities filming throughout the world, to go to Hollywood, do big movies. You know, we have a wonderful actress sitting here at the table at the moment, Rachel Griffiths, who's enjoyed enormous success in film and television all throughout through America, and is now, you know, a huge part of making work available for other actors in this country. I think it's up to the actor themselves to decide what they want to do. You know, if they go, no, I want to go and I want to do Top Gun 15 and they get the opportunity for it, good for them. If they say, no, I want to tell a story about the Mile Lake Massacre, good for them. But the thing is, let's have the opportunity to be able to say, I'll accept that Hollywood offer. And the only way they can get to that is to do something that's seen to give them the chance to get started. It's everybody's own personal decision to do. I'm incredibly grateful to the clout I got out of Hollywood. It gave me the opportunity to use to make things happen here that I wanted to make happen. So I'm terribly grateful for it. And we will, you know, the men and women who get these chances will make their own decision on how they want to use it.
Nick Stewart.
Thank you very much. Can I ask a twofold question? Firstly, why now? I mean, you talked about the 1880s when Australian cinema started. You talked about the 1980s where it flourished. And then, obviously, by the 1920s it had died off. Are you worried that at the moment Australian cinema is threatening to die off, that it's going to be similar to the way it was a century ago, that we're really losing that capacity to tell our own story in the same way and will be submerged again by overseas productions? The second part I'd like to say is, right at the end, you changed you made the really strong and incredibly true argument that stories are about people, and people are people everywhere. Why do we need Australian stories? What is it why would you justify to the government that we need Australian stories more than we need Australian infrastructure?
What are you saying? Put the money into bridges or something?
Well, that's what the government... I mean, at the moment, we've got a Prime Minister who says he's proud to be the infrastructure Prime Minister. How is it that you actually encourage people to realise we've got all this talk about productivity? You're sitting next to a very senior Financial Review contributor, columnist. The Financial Review says industry is what the country's all about. Productivity is what the country's all about. How do you convince ordinary government members that actually there is something beyond productivity? There is culture, there is life, there is meaning.
Yeah. I think the first thing is in terms of, you know, how do you convince them that to put money into Australian film or whatever instead of infrastructure or whatever. I think the fact of the matter is, in having this money invested into Australian stories, Australian film and television, that money's being sent here. That adds to their coffers, not takes away from it, right? The other, what was it? Is the first one basically about, oh, why now? Why now? Am I worried? No, I'm not worried. You know why I'm not worried? Because I know we'll win. I know that every time, you know, the only thing that I get that oh, it doesn't even annoy me really, it's just how it is. Every 5 years we have to come down here and we have to knock on the door of some Prime Minister and we have to go, hey, it's the arts. It's not the swimmers, you know, it's not the corporates, it's not the this, it's not that, it's the arts. It's about our culture. It's about who we are, what we aim for as people. And they get it. They know that. They then sit there and go, well, how do we shuffle the deck? How do we make it work? And at the moment, there's a big game in the world called streamers, and that's a lot of money around. And yes, could we be swamped? Yes, we could be swamped. It's what happened back in the, you know, when the American distributors couldn't be bothered with our stuff and more interested in their own. Do I blame the American streamers for wanting to do American stuff? Not at all. They want their culture up there. But we're saying, fellas, you're getting our money. We want to tell our stories.
Georgia Curry.
Georgia Curry, Canberra Weekly. I just wanted to know your opinion on the prevalence of reality television at the moment and the apparent public appetite for it, and also the allure of it to TV executives, because it's so much cheaper to make than a drama.
Look, all of that stuff is right about it's cheaper to make and we've moved a lot to reality on television. But, you know, when my son was like 8 or 9 years old, the first Survivor started, right? And I said, we're going to watch that. And we did. You know, we'd watch it every Wednesday night or whatever it was. It was our thing. You know, we bonded over Survivor. I'm so glad Survivor happened. I'm so glad I got to share that with my son. And then my daughter was into food. MasterChef started or something. You know, and I'm not. You know, like, you know, I eat hamburgers. And so we sat down and we started watching MasterChef, and they're talking about food and whatever. And then for about 8 weeks. And then she had to go somewhere, overseas or something. The 9th week, I turned it on. I get caught up in it, totally. You know, I enjoy it. It's, you know, it's entertainment. You know, there's various forms of entertainment. People have hard lives. They want to go, give me something that makes me not think about what I'm going through at the moment. So that area of reality television, as to whether the commercial channels should be doing that because it's cheaper, hey, they're things that have got to be worked out too. You're right. But it's a place for it. I've enjoyed so much different reality television. I don't knock it.
Mr Schubert.
Misha Schubert here as the Director of the National Press Club. Thanks for a crackerjack address. Bryan, the country's headed to a referendum later this year to be asked to vote on whether Indigenous Australians are recognised in the Constitution and whether there should be a voice. Just wondering if that's an issue you've had a chance to think much about and what your kind of thoughts are personally on that opportunity for the country.
I'll be voting yes. If Marcia Langton says it's the right thing to do, then I'll do it. Simple as that.
Okay. Thank you.
Tony Melville.
Tony Melville, the Director of the National Press Club. I told a few friends I was coming here today to see Bryan Brown, and when the third one said, oh yeah, I saw him he was in Breaker Morant. I said, why? Why is it every one of them said he was in Breaker Morant? And I said, the third one, why? And they said, oh, I saw it on Channel 97 at the weekend on the free-to-air television. And that was my question. Are we seeing death of that free-to-air television by the networks, streamers, the Netflix and whatever? Is it going to go the way of some newspapers? And, you know, is that a bad thing to you? And also, could maybe some of those networks themselves start burying their Australian content provisions and things onto some of those sort of 97, 98, 99 channels and things like that?
Well, I think the question's above my pay grade.
Right.
But I think it's great to think that you're able to go on television and see a film that we made 40 years ago that is a very strong piece of Australian storytelling, that shows our spirit and shows how our people behave. There's been many other films made from that time that shows us in different ways, but still the spirit of the place. Just a little story about that film. When Bruce Beresford asked me to do the film, he said, oh, by the way, Bryan, the bloke you're playing, he's got a moustache. You've got to grow a moustache. Well, I tried to grow moustaches when I was, 18 or 19 when I used to go up the coast surfing and that. It always used to look like, like it was out here, it was up there, it was horrible. And so I said, oh, rightio, Bruce. So I started to grow this moustache, and anyway, after about 3 weeks, I rang him and I said, Bruce, now look, I don't really have to have a moustache, do I? You know, like, and he said, Bryan, it's a real character. He existed. You've got to have a moustache. So I go out and I go down for rehearsals about 3 weeks later, and I'm starting to sort of get somewhere, right? I go down to rehearsals, and into rehearsals walks John Waters, who's got this thing like this. And then Rod Mulliner, another actor, comes in, and he's got this beautiful thing too. And I felt like, I felt terrible. And I hated myself in the movie. I thought, oh, I looked at, I went, all I do is toss out one-liners all the time. Toss out one-liners. There's nothing to the character. You know, as soon as I reckon 10 minutes after they said wrap on that movie, I went into the toilet and I cut my moustache off, and I thought, if they want pickups, they'll have to use another bloke. But, and so I went, I'll never get another job. I'll never get another job in my life because of this movie. And the movie came out and people went, I really like your character. And I was like, yes, no, I do too. It got me more jobs than any other movie I ever did, I think.
I thought you were going to say they really liked your moustache. But,
I recommend Googling, actually. I did that, and it is a magnificent moustache.
Okay. Julie Hare has one more question.
Thank you. I'm going to end on a double question, if you don't mind. My first question is, enrolments in university humanities and arts degrees are at a record low. Basically, people don't feel they've got the time to read the canon, and even, you know, Summer of the 17th Doll, it's just too long. What would you say that to young people that they're missing out on by not studying arts and humanities? And my second question is, do you think the Australian media in general is supportive of the arts and cultural life in Australia, and what else they could do to improve their coverage?
Look, on the second part first, I think yes, I think the media and I think people are, but when I go back to what it was like, there was nothing. You know, nothing happens fast enough for us. Nothing's ever good enough for us. But we do move forward. We do change. It does get better. And so, you know, like, the art exists in Australia. You know, people go to the art, look at the Archibald Prize, there's lines of people to see it. People go to the theatre. People turn on their telly and watch things. You know, it is alive. It's just that we take it for granted, I believe. Can it be healthier? Yeah, I mean, what I'm talking about can make it healthier with the streamers. I'm sure in other areas there's things can be done that could make theatre healthier or other areas healthier. But, you know, they're not my game to know what some of those answers are. And then what was the other one?
It was about young people studying arts and humanities at university.
My son's 30, and it's really hard to get him to read a book.
Oh.
However, when he reads a book, he always rings me and said, I loved it. Now, let me tell you very quickly here. Then, I don't think they're any different, particularly boys. I don't think boys are any different to how they were. I never read. The subject I hated most at school was English. I couldn't relate to a single thing in it. All the books were Great Expectations, for Christ's sake. How could I relate to that as a kid from the Bankstown area? How could I relate to any of that story? And poetry, are you joking? Shakespeare, you know. Romeo, Romeo, where art thou? You know, like, whatever happened to, hey, you want to kiss and a cuddle in the lane? You know, it made no sense. I've spent 50 years in the English language, reading plays, reading books, reading scripts. It's my life. I interpret characters. I now actually write books. You know, crime, because, you know, I'm from the western suburbs. Us boys know how to write crime. You come round to things. You know, things change, we change, but we are human beings with a massive curiosity. And sometimes our curiosity is at an ebb because something else is distracting us, but then we come back to being curious. Don't worry, it'll work out.
Thank you so much.
That's a perfect note to end. Thank you.